Welcome to This Explainer. Right now, all over the globe, immigration and national identity are basically the absolute focal points of elections, shaping everything from housing markets to how neighbors interact. So, unpacking these debates is incredibly crucial for understanding our current political climate. Today, we're taking a completely neutral look at a highly debated political commentary piece that tackles Australia's national identity. Now, topics like this can get incredibly heated, we know, but our goal here is simply to examine the arguments as they're presented in our source material. We are absolutely not taking any political sides today. Instead, we're going to break down the commentator's specific assertions about culture and integration and literally just map out the exact perspectives being discussed. Let's get into it. Okay, so it really all boils down to one fascinating, honestly pretty philosophical question that frames this entire debate. How does a nation define its culture? Does a country function best as a mosaic, where entirely separate identities exist side by side without fundamentally blending? Or does it need a single unifying umbrella, a dominant cultural framework that everyone steps under? The commentary piece we're exploring today argues strongly for that second option. It suggests that a country absolutely requires a cohesive, overarching national identity to successfully integrate new arrivals and maintain social cohesion. Let's see exactly how the source builds this argument. To navigate this complex and polarized topic, we'll follow the source's lead and break the commentary down into four specific parts. 1, the monoculturalism proposition. 2, the political pushback. 3, the 1950s integration model. And finally, 4, the modern migration debate. Starting right off with Section 1, the monoculturalism proposition. This is basically the catalyst for the whole debate. Our source material centers heavily around this exact statement from One Nation leader Pauline Hanson at the National Press Club. She said, and I quote, "We cannot be a multicultural society. We are a multiracial society, but we must be monocultural. Australians must live under the one cultural umbrella." The commentator we're analyzing calls this statement a necessary hammer blow to current doctrines. Why a hammer blow? Well, because according to the source, the prevailing political consensus for decades has basically just been to champion multiculturalism without question. So Hanson's declaration is framed here as a deliberate shock to the system, intended to shatter that consensus and force a very direct conversation about prioritizing a unified, single culture over divided enclaves. To back this stance up, the commentator points straight to history. They argue that official multiculturalism essentially started out as a political experiment back in the 1970s, during the Whitlam-era, and Malcolm Fraser just kind of carried it on. But the host's real grievance here goes way deeper than a history lesson. It's actually about voter disenfranchisement. The source argues that the Australian public never actually got a democratic vote on this massive civilization-altering policy shift. No national referendum, no robust public debate. Instead, the commentator asserts the public was simply told, from the top down, to accept it. And if they resisted, the source claims citizens were threatened with being labeled racist. This sense of historical grievance is completely foundational to the commentator's entire argument against current integration strategies. Moving to Section 2, the political pushback. Because, as you can imagine, the reaction to this was immediate and intense. The source highlights a really stark contrast in how this debate played out. Opponents treated Hanson's speech like absolute heresy. The commentator even compares the sheer outrage to the historical reaction Galileo faced for daring to say the Earth moves around the sun. It's that intense. When you look at the two sides, the defense of multiculturalism focuses heavily on things like vibrant cuisines, sharing unique stories, and celebrating differences. Meanwhile, the monocultural counter-argument pushes for total integration, insisting that diversity has to take a backseat to a single unifying cultural umbrella that binds everyone together. And we get some very specific, honestly pretty literal examples of this pushback from the commentator. For instance, left-wing activist Gregory Andrews jokingly posted a video auditing his own pantry. He claimed he'd have to throw out his kimchi and pomegranate molasses and literally only keep white flour if monoculturalism actually took hold. It really goes to show how fast these massive national identity debates can jump straight from parliamentary policy right into our kitchen cabinets. On a more formal note, the source points to New South Wales Labour Minister Jahad Dib, who countered by stating there are 27 million unique Australian stories. He emphasized that diversity is fundamentally the nation's strength and argued that multiculturalism is about way more than just a variety of foods. But here's the thing. The commentator absolutely blasts these responses as a deliberate, calculated deflection. The source argues that advocates of multiculturalism often act like cultural snobs. Meaning, politicians and activists will happily lean on superficial arguments about fun festivals and vibrant cuisine just to avoid dealing with the much messier, complex, and sometimes negative realities of a fractured society. According to this analysis, whenever the conversation tries to pivot to serious issues like ethnic crime gangs, forced marriages, or imported sectarian conflicts, the debate is instantly shut down. The source claims this food and diversity shield is used to silence legitimate criticism, leaving vital social issues completely unaddressed by the political class. All right, Section 3, the 1950s integration model. Let's look back at some history. To offer a concrete solution to what they see as a modern failure, the source turns the clock way back to the late 1950s. This was the era of the massive post-war migration boom under Prime Minister Sir Robert Menzies, the founder of the Liberal Party. Now, to understand why this matters, you have to picture the sheer scale here. Hundreds of thousands of Europeans were arriving on Australian shores, fundamentally changing the country's demographic makeup. Yet the commentator argues that back then, before official multiculturalism existed, Australia had a very different and, in their view, far more successful compact with its incoming migrants to manage that massive influx. To prove this, the source unearths this fascinating piece of physical history. They examine a literal brochure given to Greek migrants sailing to Australia at the time. Printed in both English and Greek, this document laid out incredibly specific, uncompromising expectations. Migrants were asked to adopt the attitude that, quote, Australia is my new home. It told them they must expect differences, they must make every effort to become a part of the country, and, in no uncertain terms, it firmly stated, I must learn the language. Seeing a document like this really highlights the stark contrast in messaging. It was a clear, unapologetic expectation that newcomers had to actively join the mainstream. But check out this quote from the same brochure, because it brilliantly illustrates the nuance of that historical policy. For by preserving the best of the arts and tradition and culture of that land of my birth, I shall be contributing something of spiritual as well as material value to my new home. The source emphasizes this detail to show that the 1950s approach wasn't actually about erasing a migrant's past identity or forcing assimilation into some blank slate. Instead, it was about bringing the absolute best of their heritage, their work ethic, their arts, their traditions, and using it to spiritually and materially enrich a unified, singular new home. It was about building something greater together rather than just acting as, and this is the commentator's incredibly specific phrase here, a new source of souvlaki. And finally, Section 4, the modern migration debate. Let's see how this history applies to today's landscape. The commentator takes this 1950s baseline and uses it to sharply critique both major political parties today, arguing that neither can actually articulate a cogent integration strategy while dealing with record-breaking migration numbers. First, the source points to the Labour Party, justifying a massive 1.4 million migrant intake, ostensibly for vital healthcare work. But the commentator expresses serious doubt that all these hundreds of thousands of arrivals are actually working as nurses in elder care. Then, the source pivots over to the Liberal Party, criticizing their focus on linking migration numbers to housing construction. The claim here is that this effectively puts property developers right in the driver's seat of the nation's demographic future, prioritizing economic output and real estate over social cohesion and cultural unity. It raises a pretty heavy question: who is actually designing the future of the nation's communities? So, synthesizing all these historical and modern points, the source arrives at its ultimate conclusion. The proposition currently being put forward is that an ideal policy would essentially mirror that 1950s Menzies-era approach. The message to migrants should be encouraging, bring your best self, your strongest traditions, and your hardest work, but crucially, integrate seamlessly. The goal, according to the source, is for all arrivals to make the nation their physical and spiritual home, living united as part of one great culture, pulling in the exact same direction under one flag. As we wrap up this explainer, we want to leave you with a final, provocative thought based on the complex arguments we've just mapped out. The source makes a really strong historical case for monoculturalism. But looking forward, in a highly globalized, hyper-connected 21st century, what does a unified national culture actually look like? Is a 1950s integration model truly adaptable to the modern world? Or does modern diversity require a completely new kind of framework altogether? These are the big questions shaping the future of our communities. Thanks so much for exploring them with us today on this explainer.